Water. Just a drop of water. The rasp of the desperate plea cut through the morning mist like a dull blade. Osric froze, the wooden bucket still dripping in his calloused hands. The forest path before him, usually empty at this early hour, now held the crumpled form of a man. Blood darkened the stranger's fine cloak, now torn and soiled with mud. His face, though smeared with dirt and dried blood, bore the unmistakable sharpness of noble features. A silver dagger with royal engravings hung loosely from his belt, its pommel catching the first light of dawn filtering through the ancient oaks. Osric hesitated. 32 winters had taught him caution. In the kingdom of Caerwyn, commoners who meddled in the affairs of nobility often found themselves dangling from gallows by sunset. Yet the man's eyes held no arrogance now, only the desperate plea of one mortal to another. Just water, the man whispered again, his voice as parched as summer fields. Kneeling beside the fallen stranger, Osric tilted his bucket. Drink slowly, he murmured, supporting the man's head with one rough hand. Too much at once will make you sick. The nobleman gulped greedily, water spilling down his chin and neck, mingling with blood and sweat. When he finished, his breathing came easier, though his wound still seeped crimson through his rich garments. I can take you to my hut, Osric offered, tearing a strip from his own coarse linen shirt to press against the man's wound. I have clean cloths, calendula, and apple cider vinegar. My mother taught me. The stranger attempted to protest, but consciousness slipped from him like water through fingers. With a sigh, Osric hoisted the man onto his shoulders. The weight was considerable, made heavier by what appeared to be a concealed chainmail beneath the cloak. Mother will not be pleased, Osric muttered to himself as he trudged the winding path toward his thatched hut, where herbs hung drying from the low ceiling beams. Inside, the single room smelled of earth and healing plants. Osric's mother, Elswith, looked up from her spinning, her weathered face registering first shock, then fear. By all the saints, son, have you lost your wits? She hissed, rising unsteadily to her feet. That's noble blood on your hands. And it will be on my conscience if I let him die, Osric replied, laying the unconscious man on his own straw pallet. Help me, mother. You know more of wounds than I. Through the night, they worked by firelight. Elswith cleaned the deep gash with vinegar, while Osric prepared poultices of yarrow and comfrey. The wound was clean, made by a fine blade, not the crude weapons of bandits. This was no common robbery. As dawn approached, the stranger's fever broke. His eyes, clear and blue as summer skies, opened to find Osric dozing in a chair beside him. You have my gratitude, the man said softly, startling Osric awake. I am Theodric, son of Anselm, the king's marshal. Before Osric could respond, the ground trembled with the approach of horses. Many horses. The thunder of hooves and the clank of armor shattered the morning quiet. Elswith peered through a crack in the shutters, her face ashen. The king's riders, she whispered, clutching her shawl. A dozen at least. They bear the royal standard, the Black Raven. Osric's heart sank. Stay inside, mother. He stepped through the low doorway, squinting in the pale morning light. 12 mounted knights encircled the humble dwelling, their armor gleaming like captured stars. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, urged his stallion forward. By order of His Majesty, the knight proclaimed, voice carrying across the clearing, surrender the man who harbors the missing lord. Osric raised his empty hands, conscious of his appearance. A simple peasant in dirty clothes, smudged with soot and blood. He asked not for help. I gave it because a man was dying. The captain dismounted, his hand resting on his sword hilt. He inspected Osric as one might examine a strange insect. You touched him. You possess knowledge of crown matters. The penalty is hanging. His eyes narrowed. But he saved me, Eric. The weak voice came from the doorway where Theodric leaned, supporting himself against the wooden frame. Without this man, I would be dead in the mud. The captain's face registered disbelief, then confusion. Knights exchanged glances, muttering among themselves. Lord Theodric, Eric knelt immediately. We've been searching since the ambush. When we found blood on the forest path, rise, old friend, Theodric said. Gather the men. We ride for Caerwyn Castle. His gaze shifted to Osric. And prepare a horse for this man and his mother. They come as my honored guests. Hours later, Osric found himself passing beneath the great stone archway of Caerwyn Castle. Common folk stopped to stare at the strange procession. a peasant in threadbare clothes riding alongside lords, his aging mother secured carefully in a wagon behind. The courtyard bustled with activity. Stable boys rushed forward to take the horses. Servants whispered behind their hands. A group of young nobles watched from the steps, their expressions ranging from curiosity to undisguised contempt. "A peasant enters through the main gate," one sneered loudly enough for Osric to hear. "Has Theodric brought his new squire?" Laughter rippled through the group, cutting like knives. Osric kept his eyes downcast, though his back remained straight. He had done nothing wrong, nothing shameful. Yet as he was led through the great hall toward quarters far humbler than those prepared for Theodric, he felt the weight of 100 scornful gazes. He was an intruder here, a commoner who had dared to touch noble blood. And though he had saved a life, Osric couldn't shake the feeling that his own was about to change in ways he could neither predict nor prevent. The great hall of Caerwyn Castle echoed with the sounds of celebration. Tankards clinked, minstrels played, and lords and ladies feasted on roasted pheasant and honeyed wine. The return of Lord Theodric had warranted a banquet befitting the son of the king's Marshal. Osric sat alone at the farthest end of the hall, hunched over a wooden bowl of thin gruel. His mother had been taken to the servants' quarters to rest, leaving him to face the curious and often hostile stares of the nobility alone. The rough bench beneath him was a stark contrast to the carved chairs where knights and nobles reclined. "They say he's a witch," a young lady whispered loudly behind her fan. "How else could a peasant heal such a wound? My chambermaid said Lord Theodric was nearly dead." "More likely he used common herbs and got fortunate," her companion replied. "Though mother says unclean hands shouldn't touch noble wounds. They might taint royal blood." Osric kept his eyes on his bowl, though his knuckles whitened around his spoon. "If their blood is so pure," he murmured to himself, "why does it need our herbs to heal?" "A fair question, peasant." The voice startled Osric. He looked up to find a middle-aged knight standing over him, his beard streaked with gray, his tabard bearing the emblem of a silver hawk, one of the king's personal guard. "Sir Edmund," the knight introduced himself, sitting uninvited on the bench. "I was raised a blacksmith's son before earning my spurs. I understand your discomfort." Osric nodded cautiously. "They look at me as if I've stolen something precious." "You have," Edmund said, taking a draught from his tankard. "Their comfortable belief that God made them better than you." He leaned closer. "Tell me true, where did you learn about healing wounds?" "My mother," Osric answered, "and her mother before her. Our village has no physician. Someone must know which plants draw out poison and which close wounds." Before Edmund could respond, a commotion arose near the high table. Lord Anselm, the king's Marshal and Theodric's father, had risen to his feet. Tall and imposing with a silver-streaked beard and piercing eyes, he commanded silence with his mere presence. "My son lives because of a peasant's mercy," Anselm announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Let it be known that Osric of the Western Woods is hereby granted protection under my house." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Osric felt the weight of 100 eyes upon him. "Come forward, Osric," Anselm commanded. On unsteady legs, Osric rose and approached the high table. The stone floor felt cold through his worn boots. Servants stepped aside, and nobles drew back their fine garments as if fearing contamination. Lord Anselm studied him with calculating eyes. "My son says you refuse payment for your aid." "A man needs no payment to help another, my lord," Osric replied, keeping his gaze respectfully lowered. "Yet you must want something," Anselm pressed. "Land? Title? A position at court?" Osric hesitated, acutely aware of the silence around him. "My village suffers under heavy taxation, my lord. Many cannot feed their children through winter." A bark of laughter came from further down the table. A heavy-set lord with jeweled fingers leaned forward. "The peasant thinks to lecture us on governance," Lord Radolf exclaimed. "Next he'll demand a seat at council." More laughter followed, cruel and cutting. Theodric, seated at his father's right hand, frowned, but remained silent. Anselm raised a hand for quiet. "You ask for others, not yourself." "I have what I need, my lord," Osric answered. "My neighbors do not." "Fascinating," Lord Radolf interrupted again. "But perhaps before we reorganize the kingdom on a peasant's advice, we might ask how he came to find Lord Theodric in the first place?" His eyes narrowed suspiciously. The ambush site was well hidden. Some might wonder if our charitable friend here had prior knowledge. The hall fell silent. Osric felt his blood run cold. "Are you accusing me of something, my lord?" he asked, a tremor in his voice. "I merely find it curious," Radolf continued, swirling wine in his goblet. "A simple peasant happens upon the wounded son of the king's Marshal, miles from any common path, just when our enemies would benefit most from Theodric's demise." Anselm's expression darkened. "Speak plainly, Radolf. Perhaps our humble hero was meant to finish what the assassins began," Radolf suggested. "Or perhaps he was to bring the wounded lord to those who arranged the ambush." "That's absurd," Theodric spoke at last, color rising in his face. "I would be dead if not for this man, unless his task was to keep you alive for questioning," Radolf countered. "The rebels would pay handsomely for information about the crown's defenses." Whispers erupted throughout the hall. Osric stood frozen, aware that his life now hung by the slenderest thread. "I gather herbs by the old hunting trail," he explained, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I found Lord Theodric by chance." "A convenient tale," Radolf sneered. Sir Edmund stepped forward. "My lords, I've spoken with this man. There's no guile in him." "You would vouch for him, Edmund?" Anselm asked sharply. "I would, my lord," the knight replied without hesitation. Lord Radolf scoffed. "The judgment of a commoner turned knight. How reassuring." Sir Edmund's hand moved to his sword hilt. "Watch your tongue, Radolf. Some commoners remember how to use steel." Tension crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. Osric stood trapped between powerful men whose quarrels could cost him everything. "Enough!" Theodric's voice cut through the tension. He rose, still pale from his wound but commanding attention. "Father, I was conscious when Osric found me." He showed surprise and fear, not the calculated manner of an assassin or spy. "He could have left me to die. Instead, he carried me to safety and tended my wounds through the night." Theodric turned to face the gathered nobility. "Any man who questions Osric's honor questions mine as well. Would any here do so?" The challenge hung in the air. Even Lord Radolf lowered his gaze. Anselm studied his son, then nodded. "Very well. The matter is settled." He addressed Osric directly. "You have my gratitude for my son's life. Return to your quarters. We will speak of your village's concerns tomorrow." As Osric bowed and retreated from the high table, he felt Radolf's eyes boring into his back. The heavy-set lord leaned toward a thin, sallow-faced companion, whispering behind his hand. Back in the small chamber allocated to him, Osric found his mother awake and anxious. "I heard shouting," Elswith said, clutching her shawl around bony shoulders. "Are we in danger, son?" Osric sank onto the straw mattress. "I don't know, mother. Lord Theodric defends us, but others suspect treachery." "We should never have come," she whispered. "Simple folk don't belong in castles." "We had no choice," Osric replied, rubbing his temples. "But perhaps tomorrow we can ask permission to return home." As moonlight filtered through the narrow window, casting long shadows across the stone floor, Osric couldn't shake the feeling that something far greater than their modest lives was unfolding around them, something that had begun the moment he offered water to a dying nobleman in the forest. Outside their door, unheard by either of them, footsteps paused briefly before continuing down the corridor. Dawn broke over Caerwyn Castle, painting its gray stones gold. Osric woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a fortress stirring, the distant clang of the smithy, the calls of guards changing watch, the bustling of servants preparing for the day. After checking on his mother, who still slept fitfully, he ventured into the corridor. A young page boy nearly collided with him. "There you are," the lad exclaimed. "Lord Theodric requests your presence in the training yard. I've been searching everywhere." Osric followed the boy through a labyrinth of passages and courtyards. The castle was a world unto itself, with more people than Osric's entire village. Servants carrying linens and kitchen maids balancing trays eyed him curiously as he passed. The training yard rang with the clash of steel and shouts of men. Knights in partial armor practiced with blunted swords while squires and pages scurried about, polishing equipment or fetching water. Theodric stood at the yard's edge, his arm in a sling but his bearing proud as he observed the training. "Ah, Osric," Theodric called, waving him over. "I feared you might still be sleeping. Castle life takes adjustment." "I've been awake since before first light, my lord," Osric replied. "In the village we rise with the sun to tend the fields." Theodric nodded. "Of course. Forgive my ignorance of country ways." He gestured to the practice. "What do you think of our knights?" Osric watched the men trading blows, their movements precise and powerful. They fight well, he said cautiously, though differently than the village men who defend our homes from wolves and bandits. How so? Theodric asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Your knights fight with honor, Osric explained. Village men fight to survive. A new voice cut in. What would a peasant know of fighting? Lord Radolf approached, already dressed in fine riding clothes despite the early hour. Behind him trailed his sallow-faced companion from the previous night, a man with hooded eyes that reminded Osric of a weasel. My lord, Osric bowed, hoping to avoid confrontation. I asked you a question, Radolf pressed, his jowls quivering with barely contained disdain. Osric straightened his shoulders. I know enough to protect my home and family, my lord. Radolf barked a laugh. With what? A pitchfork? Several nearby knights paused their practice to watch. Theodric's expression darkened, but before he could intervene, Radolf continued his mockery. Perhaps we should see this peasant wisdom in action, Radolf suggested, his smile cruel. Godfrey! A massive knight broke away from the practice circle. Nearly a head taller than Osric and twice as broad, he approached with the swagger of a man accustomed to intimidating others. Lord Radolf? The knight inquired, looking Osric up and down with contempt. Our guest claims knowledge of fighting, Radolf said. I thought you might offer him a practical lesson. Theodric stepped forward. This is unnecessary, Radolf. On the contrary, Radolf countered. If this man is to remain under your father's protection, shouldn't we know his capabilities? Unless you fear for your friend's safety? The challenge hung in the air. Theodric hesitated, caught between defending Osric and appearing weak before his peers. I have no wish to fight, Osric said quietly. Naturally, Radolf smirked. Cowardice is the peasant's first instinct. The yard had grown silent. Dozens of eyes watched the confrontation, waiting to see how the drama would unfold. Osric felt the weight of their judgment, the unspoken belief that he didn't belong among them. One bout, Theodric finally conceded. With wooden practice swords only. First to yield loses. Godfrey grinned, revealing a gap where 2 teeth had been knocked out in previous encounters. I'll be gentle with your pet, my lord. A squire brought 2 wooden training swords. Godfrey took his with practiced ease, testing its weight with a few casual swings. When Osric accepted the other, several onlookers snickered at his awkward grip. Stand back, Theodric instructed the gathering crowd. Give them space. Osric stood in the center of the yard, the unfamiliar weight of the practice sword heavy in his hand. He had never held such a weapon before, his experience limited to the hunting knife he used to skin rabbits and the simple staff he carried on forest paths. Begin, Theodric called. Godfrey advanced immediately, his wooden blade whistling through the air. Osric barely managed to step aside, the sword passing close enough to ruffle his hair. Another strike followed, and another. Osric retreated, using the sword more as a shield than a weapon, his movements clumsy compared to the knight's trained precision. Stop dancing and fight, someone shouted from the crowd. Godfrey pressed his advantage, driving Osric backward until he stumbled over an uneven stone. The wooden sword clattered from his grip as he fell hard on his back, knocking the wind from his lungs. Laughter erupted from the onlookers. Pathetic, Radolf commented loudly. This is who saved our Lord Theodric? The gods must truly favor fools and children. Godfrey loomed over Osric, his practice sword pointed at the fallen peasant's throat. Yield, he commanded. Shame burned through Osric like fire. Not for his lack of skill. He had never claimed to be a swordsman, but for the mockery directed not just at him, but at all common folk. In their eyes, his humiliation confirmed what they already believed, that peasants were lesser beings, unworthy of respect. I yield, Osric said, his voice steady despite the humiliation. I am no knight, nor did I claim to be. Godfrey lowered his sword, turning to accept the congratulations of his fellows. But as he turned, Osric rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his clothes with quiet dignity. Though I wonder, Osric added, his voice carrying across the now quiet yard, if Sir Godfrey would fare as well in a wheat field as I do with a sword. Godfrey whirled back, his face darkening. You mock me, peasant? Not at all, Osric replied. I merely observe that each man has his skill. Yours is fighting. Mine is growing the food that fills your belly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the yard. Several knights shifted uneasily, while others looked thoughtful. Theodric's expression betrayed a mixture of surprise and growing respect. Enough entertainment, Radolf interrupted, clearly displeased that Osric had salvaged some dignity from the encounter. "Come, Godfrey. We ride to inspect the eastern garrison." As they departed, Sir Edmund approached, offering Osric a hand. "Well spoken," the knight said quietly. "You've given them something to consider." Before Osric could reply, a commotion arose at the yard's entrance. A messenger in mud-splattered clothes rushed in, making directly for Theodric. "My lord," the man gasped, dropping to one knee. "Urgent news from the border." Theodric accepted a sealed parchment, breaking the wax with his thumb. As he read, his face grew grave. "Where is my father?" "With the king, my lord," the messenger replied. "In the council chamber." "Summon the captains," Theodric ordered, already striding toward the keep. "Sir Edmund, with me. And you, Osric. You know the western forest better than any. Come." Bewildered but obedient, Osric followed, still smarting from his public humiliation, but curious about this sudden turn of events. As they hurried toward the great keep, Theodric spoke in a low voice. "Rebels have been spotted near your village," he explained. "The same faction that ambushed me. They moved through the western woods, gathering strength." Osric's heart clenched. "My people may be in danger," Theodric finished, "or may have information vital to the kingdom's security." The great hall had been transformed. Where feasting tables had stood the previous night, maps now covered trestle tables. Lord Anselm stood with the king, a stern-faced man with a crown of gold set with rubies, and several advisors, all bent over the largest map. "Theodric," the king acknowledged as they entered. His gaze fell on Osric. "And the peasant healer, I presume?" "Yes, your majesty," Theodric confirmed. "Osric knows the western forests better than our own scouts." The king's eyes narrowed. "Does he indeed? How convenient." Osric felt cold dread seep into his bones. The king's implication was clear, the same suspicion Lord Radolf had voiced the previous night. Before he could defend himself, Lord Anselm spoke. "My son vouches for this man, your majesty." "As do I." The king studied Osric for a long moment before nodding curtly. "Very well. Approach, peasant. Show us these forests you know so well." With trembling hands, Osric stepped forward to the map, acutely aware that his knowledge, once merely the wisdom needed to gather herbs and hunt game, had suddenly become vital to the realm's defense, and perhaps to his own survival. The council chamber fell silent as Osric studied the map spread before him. The parchment showed forests, rivers, and villages, but as drawn by someone who had only glimpsed them from afar. Paths were missing, landmarks misplaced, and the true nature of the terrain obscured beneath elegant calligraphy. "Your maps are beautiful, your majesty," Osric said carefully, "but they do not show the forest as it truly is." A murmur of discontent rippled through the assembled lords. One advisor, a thin man with an ornate golden chain, stepped forward with a scowl. "These maps were drawn by the royal cartographer," he said coldly, "a man who studied his craft in Byzantium itself. Yet he did not walk these paths as I have," Osric replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "May I?" The king nodded curtly. With hesitant hands, Osric accepted a piece of charcoal from a nearby scribe. He began to mark the map, adding trails known only to woodsmen and local villagers, indicating hidden ravines where men might be ambushed, and marking secret springs where rebels might camp. "The path your soldiers would take leads here," he said, tracing the main road. "But smugglers and poachers use these smaller trails. They converge at the old stone circle, a day's march from my village." Theodric leaned forward, intrigued. "You believe the rebels camp there? It offers protection from the elements, fresh water, and clear views of approaching forces," Osric explained. "It's where I would go if I wished to remain hidden, yet maintain watch over the king's road." Lord Anselm stroked his beard thoughtfully. "The peasant's reasoning is sound, but how can we verify this before committing our forces?" "I could go," Osric offered, surprising himself with his boldness. "I know how to move through the forest without being seen. The rebels would not suspect a simple herb gatherer. Or they would welcome their spy home," came a familiar voice from the chamber entrance. Lord Radolf stood there, his face flushed from riding. Behind him, the sallow-faced man whispered something in his ear. "My lords," Radolf continued, advancing into the room, "before we entrust the kingdom's security to a peasant, consider this. The rebel leader is said to be a commoner who claims noble blood was stolen from his line. What better spy than one of their own kind?" The king's expression darkened. You make grave accusations, Radolf. I speak only of possibilities, Your Majesty, Radolf replied with a bow. But I find it curious that this man appears precisely when we most need knowledge of these forests. Forests where rebels who share his heritage now gather. Osric felt the ground shifting beneath him. Each word from Radolf's mouth wove a noose of suspicion around his neck. I have lived my entire life in service to no one but my family and neighbors, Osric said, fighting to keep his voice steady. I found Lord Theodric by chance and helped him as any decent man would. Noble sentiments, Radolf sneered. Yet you now stand in the King's Council marking our military maps. A remarkable rise for a simple peasant. Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted outside the chamber. The heavy oak doors burst open, and Sir Edmund entered, supporting a blood-soaked messenger. Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, Edmund said grimly, but the rebels have made their move. The messenger, a young man barely out of boyhood, gasped for breath. The western village, attacked at dawn, they took hostages. Osric's blood ran cold. Which village? Speak, man. Fernhollow, the messenger managed before his knees buckled. My village, Osric whispered, color draining from his face. My people. The king rose from his seat. Lord Anselm, prepare the royal guard. We ride within the hour. Your Majesty, Theodric interjected. A large force will be seen coming. The rebels may kill the hostages. What do you suggest? The king demanded. A small party could approach unseen using the paths Osric showed us, Theodric said. We could assess their numbers and position before the main force arrives. The king considered this, then nodded. You will lead this scouting party, Theodric. Take Sir Edmund and a handful of your best men. His gaze turned to Osric. And this peasant, whether he proves spy or ally. Your Majesty, Radolf protested. You cannot trust. Enough, Radolf. The king cut him off. If he betrays us, Theodric will end him. If he serves faithfully, we shall reassess his standing. He fixed Osric with a penetrating stare. Your fate now rests on your actions, peasant. As the council dispersed to prepare for battle, Osric sought out his mother. He found her in their small chamber, already packing their few belongings. I heard the servants talking, Elswith said, her hands trembling. Fernhollow is under attack. I'm going with Lord Theodric to help, Osric told her, taking her weathered hands in his. You must remain here where it's safe. Tears welled in her eyes. They suspect you of treachery, don't they? Some do, he admitted. But this is my chance to prove my loyalty and save our neighbors. Be careful, my son, she whispered. The game of lords is played with common lives. In the castle courtyard, Theodric had assembled his scouting party. 6 knights, including Sir Edmund, all in light armor for swift movement. They wore no bright heraldry that might catch the sun and reveal their position. Here, Theodric said, offering Osric a short sword in a plain leather scabbard. You'll need this. Osric accepted the weapon with uncertainty. I showed poor skill with a sword this morning. Practice swords in a training yard are not the same as steel when defending one's home, Theodric replied. Besides, we need you for your knowledge, not your swordplay. They rode out under the cover of early evening, taking the smaller paths that Osric had marked on the map. As night fell, they dismounted and continued on foot, leaving their horses with a trusted squire. The forest transformed in darkness. What seemed familiar by day became mysterious by night, yet Osric moved with confidence, leading the party through twisted paths that even the knights with all their training would have missed. How do you navigate without stars? Sir Edmund whispered as clouds obscured the night sky. By the feel of the ground beneath my feet, Osric replied. The smell of the pines to the north and the oaks to the south. The sound of the distant river. The forest speaks to those who listen. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest. As dawn approached, Osric raised his hand, signaling the party to halt. Ahead, through the trees, smoke rose from the village of Fernhollow. Theodric crouched beside him. What do you see? Something is wrong, Osric murmured, studying the scene. The smoke comes only from the central fire pit. If the village were truly raided, houses would be burning. A trap? Sir Edmund suggested, hand moving to his sword. Or a deception, Osric replied. Wait here. Before Theodric could protest, Osric had vanished into the underbrush, moving with a silence born from years of hunting. The knights exchanged concerned glances but remained in position, watching the village clearing ahead. Osric circled the village, keeping to the shadows of the forest edge. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Armed men in mismatched armor loitered around the village well, but they were too few for a true raiding party. The villagers were gathered in the center, looking frightened but largely unharmed. Returning to Theodric's position, Osric reported what he had seen. There are perhaps 20 men, poorly armed and undisciplined. They've gathered the villagers but haven't harmed them. This is not a full rebel force. It's a distraction. Theodric frowned. A distraction from what? The king, Osric realized with sudden clarity. The castle will be under-defended with the royal guard riding here. Theodric's face paled. We must send warning. There's no time, Osric said, but I know another way. He pointed to a steep ridge overlooking the village. From there, we can signal the main force when they approach, and I know a path through the caves that can return us to the castle in half the time of the main road. Sir Edmund looked skeptical. Caves, an old smuggler's route, Osric explained. My grandfather showed me as a boy. The rebels won't know of it. Theodric made his decision quickly. Edmund, take 3 men and free the villagers when you see our signal. Osric and I will return to warn the castle. My lord, Edmund protested, sending yourself and the peasant alone is the fastest way, Theodric finished. If Osric meant to betray us, he would have done so already. As the knights prepared to rescue the villagers, Osric led Theodric up a nearly invisible path toward the caves. They moved swiftly through the morning mist, the forest alive with birdsong that belied the danger around them. Why didn't you tell anyone about these caves before? Theodric asked as they climbed. Osric hesitated. Some secrets belong to the common folk. They're how we survive when lords fight over lands we till. You don't trust the nobility, Theodric observed. Would you in my place? Osric countered. Before Theodric could answer, voices drifted up from below. A group of armed men, far more organized than those in the village, moved through the forest. Their leader, a tall figure in a tarnished breastplate, gestured toward the castle road. The rebels' main force, Theodric whispered. You were right. They watched in tense silence as the rebel band passed below, unaware of the observers above. When they had gone, Osric and Theodric continued to the cave entrance, a narrow opening hidden behind a curtain of vines. It will be dark inside, Osric warned. Stay close. The cave system was a maze of twisting passages, the air cool and damp. Water dripped from stalactites, and their footsteps echoed faintly despite their attempts at quiet. Osric moved with certainty, navigating by memory and the subtle feel of air currents against his skin. How many times have you traveled this way? Theodric asked, his voice hushed in the darkness. Only twice before, Osric admitted. Once with my grandfather, and once when bringing herbs to a dying child when the king's road was flooded. Yet you remember every turn? When your life depends on remembering a path, you don't forget it. They emerged hours later on the far side of the forest, the castle visible in the distance across open fields. As they hurried toward it, Theodric studied his companion with new eyes. You've saved the kingdom twice now, he said. First my life, and now perhaps the king's. I saved a man in the forest and showed you a path through caves, Osric replied. If that saves a kingdom, then perhaps the kingdom stands on frailer ground than I realized. Theodric laughed, despite the gravity of their situation. There's wisdom in you, Osric of Fernhollow. Wisdom I suspect we've long needed in the council chamber. As they approached the castle gates, horns sounded the alarm. The enemy had been spotted. But thanks to Osric's knowledge and instincts, the warning had come in time. What neither man knew as they raced through the gate was that Osric's greatest test, and triumph, still lay ahead. Caerwyn Castle erupted into frenzied activity. Knights rushed to don armor, archers took positions along the battlements, and servants hurried to secure the inner keep. Osric and Theodric, still breathless from their journey, were escorted directly to the king's war chamber. The rebels approach from the south, Theodric reported, pointing to the map. Perhaps 200 men, well-armed and organized, not the rabble we expected. The king's face was grim, and the village hostages. A diversion, your majesty, Osric explained. A small force holds Fernhollow while their main strength targets the castle. Sir Edmund remains to free the villagers. Lord Anselm nodded approvingly. A sound strategy. The peasants' intelligence has proven valuable. Lord Radolf, standing among the king's advisors, scowled. Or perhaps too convenient. How do we know this isn't part of their plan? To draw our defenses to the wrong position. Because I stake my life on it. Theodric replied sharply. "Osric could have betrayed me a dozen times in those caves. Instead, he brought warning that may save us all." Before Radolf could protest further, a guard burst into the chamber. "Your Majesty, the rebels have breached the lower bailey." The king rose, hand on his sword. "How? The gates were sealed." "Treachery, sire," the guard reported. "Someone opened the eastern postern." All eyes turned to Osric, suspicion flaring anew. The king's face hardened. "Take him," he commanded. Two guards moved forward, seizing Osric's arms. "Your Majesty, he was with me," Theodric protested. "He couldn't have—" An explosion shook the castle walls, cutting off Theodric's defense. Dust rained from the ceiling as the sound of fighting grew closer. "Greek fire," Lord Anselm muttered. "They've breached the inner defenses." The king made a swift decision. "Secure the traitor in the western tower. The rest of you, to arms." As Osric was dragged away, he caught sight of Radolf's sallow-faced companion slipping out a side door, a satisfied smile playing on his thin lips. Understanding dawned like a thunderclap. "Your Majesty," Osric called desperately. "The traitor is Lord Radolf's man. Watch him." But his warning was lost in the chaos as the chamber emptied, nobles and knights rushing to defend their king. The guards half-dragged Osric through corridors now filling with smoke, toward the western tower that served as the castle's prison. As they ascended the tower stairs, Osric's mind raced. His mother remained somewhere in the castle, vulnerable and alone. The villagers of Fern Hollow, his neighbors and friends, waited for rescue. And now, betrayal threatened to undo everything. The guards threw him roughly into a small cell, the door clanging shut with finality. Through a narrow window, Osric could see parts of the battle unfolding. Rebels scaling walls with grappling hooks, defenders pouring burning oil from the battlements, smoke rising from multiple fires within the castle grounds. "Mother," he whispered, pressing his forehead against the cold stone. "Be safe." Hours passed, marked only by the distant sounds of combat and the shifting patterns of smoke and sunlight. Then, unexpectedly, the cell door creaked open. Osric turned, expecting executioners, but found Elswith standing there, a ring of keys in her trembling hand. "Mother," he embraced her, hardly believing his eyes. "How did you—" "No time," she interrupted, her voice urgent. "The castle falls. The king is cornered in the great hall with Lord Anselm and a handful of knights. Lord Theodric fights by the eastern wall. And Lord Radolf?" A grim smile crossed her weathered face. "Fled with his household when the tide turned. But his advisor remains, directing the rebels as if he commanded them." "He does," Osric realized. "He's their leader, hiding in plain sight all along." They descended the tower stairs cautiously. The corridors were eerily empty, most defenders having been drawn to critical defense points. Smoke hung in the air, and distant screams punctuated the clash of steel. "Go to the chapel crypt," Osric instructed his mother. "It's the safest place now." She clutched his arm. "And you?" "I must find Theodric and the king." Elswith pressed something into his hand, a small pouch of herbs. "For courage," she said, "as I taught you." With a final embrace, they parted. Osric moved through the castle like a shadow, avoiding rebel patrols and staying to lesser-known passages. The herbs from his mother's pouch, crushed and held beneath his nose, cleared his mind and sharpened his senses, an old forester's trick for hunting in darkness. He found Theodric near the eastern gatehouse, bleeding from a shoulder wound but still fighting alongside a dwindling group of defenders. The rebels pressed them hard, their greater numbers gradually overwhelming the skilled but exhausted knights. "Osric!" Theodric exclaimed, parrying a thrust from a rebel swordsman. "How did you escape?" "No time to explain," Osric replied, ducking beneath a wild swing and kicking the attacker's knee. The man fell with a cry, and Osric claimed his dropped sword. "The king?" "Great hall," Theodric grunted, dispatching another opponent. "Surrounded, we can't reach him." "There's another way," Osric said, "but we must hurry." Between clashes, he explained his plan. The castle's original builders had created hidden passages, not the grand secret corridors of legend, but humble service routes for servants to move unseen. As a guest in the castle, Osric had noticed things the nobles overlooked: the subtle draft from behind a tapestry, the servants emerging from seemingly solid walls with fresh linens and food. "You learned all this in 2 days?" Theodric asked incredulously as they disengaged from the fighting and slipped down a side passage. "I watched and listened," Osric replied. as common folk must. Behind the kitchens, now abandoned in the chaos, Osric found what he sought, a narrow door disguised as part of the wall paneling. It opened to reveal a cramped passage barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. "This leads to the Great Hall?" Theodric asked doubtfully. "To the dais behind the throne," Osric confirmed. "Servants use it to attend the king without disturbing court proceedings." They moved through the passage in single file, the air thick with dust and the smell of old stone. Ahead, voices grew clearer, among them the cold, precise tones of Radolf's advisor. "Your Majesty should consider the generous terms I offer," the man was saying. "Abdicate in favor of one with true right to rule, and your life will be spared." "I would sooner die than yield to traitors," the king's voice replied, strained but defiant. Osric and Theodric reached a small viewing grate in the passage wall. Through it, they could see the great hall transformed into a battlefield. Broken furniture and bodies littered the floor. The king stood with his back to the throne, bloodied but unbowed. Lord Anselm lay wounded nearby, clutching his side. A dozen royal guards formed a protective semicircle, facing twice their number of rebels. And before them all stood Radolf's advisor, now dressed in armor bearing the emblem of a crowned serpent, the ancient symbol of a noble house thought extinct for generations. "I am Aldric of House Serpentis," the man proclaimed, "rightful heir to these lands before your grandfather's treachery stole them. Today, justice returns." "House Serpentis fell into rebellion and paid the price," the king countered. "Your claim died with your traitor ancestors." Aldric's face twisted with rage. "My claim lives in my blood. Blood your family has tried to spill for 3 generations." Theodric turned to Osric. "We must act now." While they parley, nodding, Osric continued down the passage until they reached its end, a concealed door behind the throne dais. Through cracks in the ancient wood, he could see the standoff continuing. "On my signal," Theodric whispered, drawing his sword. "We emerge fighting. Target Aldric if possible. Without their leader, the rebels may falter." Osric gripped his borrowed sword, fear and determination warring within him. He was no knight, no trained warrior, yet here he stood, about to charge into battle alongside the son of the king's marshal. Theodric raised his hand, preparing to give the signal, when suddenly, the great hall doors burst open. Sir Edmund strode in, bloodied but triumphant, with a dozen knights behind him. "Your Majesty," Edmund called. "The village is secured, and reinforcements approach from the north." The distraction was all they needed. As Aldric turned toward this new threat, Theodric kicked open the hidden door. They emerged behind the rebel leader, catching him completely by surprise. Chaos erupted. The king's guards, reinvigorated by the arrival of allies, pressed forward. Sir Edmund's knights engaged from the main entrance, and in the critical center, Theodric and Osric confronted Aldric himself. "Surrender, traitor!" Theodric demanded, his sword at the ready. Aldric's face contorted with hatred. "Never!" He drew his blade, a fine weapon with a jeweled hilt, and attacked with the skill of one trained since childhood. Theodric met the assault, their swords ringing in the smoky air of the great hall, but his wounded shoulder slowed him. Aldric pressed his advantage, forcing Theodric back step by step. Osric circled, looking for an opening, his peasant's instincts for survival guiding him where formal training might have failed. He saw what knights might miss, the uneven flagstone where Aldric would step next, the subtle tell in the man's stance before he lunged. When Aldric's boot caught on the flagstone, throwing him slightly off balance, Osric acted, not with the sword, a weapon foreign to his hands, but with the simple directness of a man who had wrestled calves and subdued wild boars. He dropped his blade, lunged forward, and tackled Aldric around the knees. Both men crashed to the floor, Aldric's sword skittering away. Theodric moved to help, but was intercepted by a rebel knight. Osric and Aldric grappled on the stone floor, rolling dangerously close to the great hearthfire. Aldric was trained, but Osric was strong from years of field work. The rebel leader reached for a dagger at his belt, but Osric caught his wrist, slamming it against the floor until the weapon fell from numbed fingers. "Peasant dog!" Aldric spat, landing a blow to Osric's jaw that sent stars across his vision. "You should have stayed in your hovel," Osric answered, not with words but with a headbutt that broke Aldric's nose in a spray of blood. The rebel leader howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Osric to roll them both over, pinning Aldric beneath him. Around them, the tide of battle had turned decisively. The king's forces, bolstered by Sir Edmund's arrival and the unexpected attack from behind, overwhelmed the rebels. Seeing their leaders subdued and their advantage lost, many threw down their weapons. Theodric dispatched his opponent and hurried to Osric's side, pressing his sword tip to Aldric's throat. "Well done, my friend," he said, breathing heavily. "It seems a peasant's wrestling is worth a dozen court sword lessons." Guards secured Aldric in heavy chains. The great hall, now littered with the aftermath of battle, fell oddly quiet as survivors caught their breath and tended to the wounded. The king approached, his royal mantle torn and bloodied but his bearing no less regal. He studied Osric, who rose unsteadily to his feet and bowed. "Your Majesty," Osric said, suddenly aware of his presumption in laying hands on a nobleman, even a traitorous one. "Twice now you have saved my family," the king said, his voice carrying in the hushed hall. "First my nephew's life in the forest, and now my crown in my own castle." "I did only what any man might do," Osric replied, eyes downcast. "No," the king contradicted him. "Not any man. You showed courage when others showed doubt, loyalty when suspected of treachery, wisdom when lords spoke folly." He turned to Lord Anselm, now being tended by a physician. "What say you, my old friend? How shall we reward such service?" Lord Anselm, pale but clear-eyed, considered. "Land and title would be traditional, your majesty. Perhaps the eastern holdings left vacant by Baron Wulfric's passing." Murmurs spread through the hall. To grant land to a peasant was unusual but not unprecedented. Yet something in Osric's expression gave the king pause. "You seem troubled by this suggestion," the king observed. "Speak freely." Osric hesitated, then found his voice. "Forgive me, your majesty, but I have no desire for title or castle. I am a simple man who knows herbs and forests, not courtly ways." "Then what would you have of us?" the king asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. Osric thought of his village, of children with hollow cheeks during hard winters, of elders who worked until their bodies failed, of the crushing weight of taxes that left little for those who produced the realm's wealth. "Justice, your majesty," he said finally, "for my village and others like it. Fair taxation that leaves enough for children to eat. Protection from lords who see peasants as mere tools for their ambitions." The hall fell silent. Such a request, addressing not personal gain but systemic change, was unprecedented. The king studied Osric with new interest. "You ask not for yourself, but for others." "A man is nothing without his community, your majesty," Osric replied simply. "What good is a title if those I care for still suffer?" Theodric stepped forward. "Father," he addressed Lord Anselm, "perhaps there is another way to honor Osric's service, one that serves both him and the kingdom." "Speak, my son," Anselm encouraged. "Appoint him royal forester for the western provinces," Theodric suggested. "Let him serve as liaison between the crown and the common folk. Who better to understand their needs and bring their concerns to court?" The king considered this, then slowly nodded. A position never before created, yet perhaps long overdue. He turned to Osric. "Would such a role satisfy you?" "If it allows me to help my people, your majesty." "Then yes," Osric answered, scarcely believing what was happening. "So be it," the king declared. "Kneel, Osric of Fern Hollow." Heart pounding, Osric knelt on the blood-stained stones. The king drew his sword, a magnificent blade that had seen 100 battles, and touched it lightly to each of Osric's shoulders. "Rise, Sir Osric, royal forester and knight of the realm," the king proclaimed. "May you serve with the same courage and wisdom that brought you to this moment." As Osric rose, the great hall erupted in cheers, led not by nobles, but by the castle servants who had gathered at the doorways to witness the unprecedented ceremony. Even some of the knights joined in, Sir Edmund's voice among the loudest. Lord Radolf, who had slunk back into the castle once the fighting ended, watched from the shadows, his face a mask of disbelief and disgust. Yet he dared not speak against the king's decision. That evening, as healers tended the wounded and servants cleared debris from the battle, Osric found a quiet moment with his mother in the castle garden. Elswith wept as she touched the simple silver oak leaf pin that now marked her son's new office. "Your father would have been proud," she said, wiping her eyes. "I still can't believe it," Osric admitted. "Yesterday I was mucking stalls to earn my supper. Today I'm advising the king." "You were always meant for more than Fern Hollow could offer," Elswith said. "I've known it since you were small." Theodric found them there, his arm now properly bandaged. "Sir Osric," he greeted with a warm smile. The council awaits your first report on the conditions of the western villages. They may not like what I have to tell them, Osric warned. That, Theodric replied, is precisely why they need to hear it. As they walked toward the keep, Osric paused to look back at his mother, a peasant woman now sitting in a royal garden as if she belonged there. Perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not the title or position, but the recognition that worth came not from birth but from one's actions and character. You know, Theodric said thoughtfully as they climbed the steps to the council chamber. When I was dying in that forest, I prayed for a miracle. I never expected it would come in the form of a peasant with a water bucket. Osric smiled. And I never thought giving water to a dying man would lead me here. The smallest kindnesses often yield the greatest rewards, Theodric observed. Not that I sought reward, Osric added quickly. Which is precisely why you deserved one, Theodric countered, pushing open the heavy oak doors to reveal the council chamber beyond, where lords and knights now rose respectfully at the entrance of a man who, just days before, they would have ignored as beneath their notice. And as Sir Osric, former peasant of Fernhollow, took his place at the king's council table, he carried with him not just his own voice, but the voices of countless others who had never before been heard within these walls. In the years that followed, bards would sing of battles and betrayals, of kings and castles, but in the villages throughout the realm, another tale was told around evening fires, how a simple act of compassion, offering water to a dying nobleman, had changed not just one man's destiny, but begun the transformation of a kingdom. For sometimes, the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. Through castle halls and village squares, they still whisper the truth that every child now learns. Not all crowns are gold. Some grow from the soil, watered by simple compassion.